history, U.S. history, intellectual history, and the history of Blacks in the Americas. Professor Udell is the author of The Political Languages of Emancipation in the British Caribbean and the U.S. South, and co-editor of several volumes, including one on Sylvia Wynter, a transculturalist rethinking modernity. His current research projects include a critical edition of the earlier works of Sylvia Wynter, collection of essays on race and politics in the Americas, and an examination of the intersection of race and caste. Welcome, Professor Udell.
Thank you. First of all, I would also like to begin by thanking the organizers for what has been a really stimulating and illuminating conference. I'm also deeply honored to be joining such a distinguished panel of speakers. As some of the speakers in the conference have done, I too would like to begin with an acknowledgement of the land of the indigenous peoples on which I'm speaking. I'm currently located in Middletown in the state of Connecticut on the lands of the Wangan peoples. Before this act became a performative gesture in a number of academic contexts, over a decade ago, a colleague of mine, Caroline Kaunui, reminded many audiences at numerous gatherings of those who previously inhabited this land. However, at the time, she remained alone. Since then, we have seen preceding academic and cultural events, myself now included in this one, that these kinds of acknowledgements have become more common. This perhaps after having exhausted the ritual of apologizing for slavery and digging up our slaveholding ancestors. Nonetheless, I feel that it's important to make such acknowledgements. Yet at the same time, as Lou Cornum and others have argued, such performative acts of institutional inclusion can obscure the antagonism that followed from genocide. As earlier panelists have pointed out, in the case of the indigenous peoples of India, the Adivasi, whom even our great Ambedkar disparaged, the struggles of the indigenous peoples continue in full throttle. In the United States, and especially on reservations, this can be quickly seen with the high rates of poverty, inequities in education and healthcare, and over-policing that many experience. Therefore, what, if anything, should be done after these acknowledgements? Decolonization, perhaps? And how exactly would that look and be carried out? And what about those populations since then displaced, such as Blacks with the building of highways across the United States, or those displaced through gentrification, as we see in many of the blue states, who abhor the racism of the so-called extreme right, but have no language to address the racial implications of the dynamics of neoliberal transnational capitalism that cannot provide housing, not to mention a living wage and healthcare, for many of its residents. Indeed, when it comes to building pipelines like the Dakota Access or with the company Enbridge, such land acknowledgements seem to disappear from well-resourced institutions. I say all this because if Patrick Wolf has taught us that settler colonialism is not an event but a structure, such can also be stated for white supremacy, in which it is conceptually embedded. White supremacy is what Sylvia Wynter has described as biocentrism. That is the master code of the industrial bourgeoisie and its ethno-class conception of being human. This ontology maps value, potential, and indeed life chances onto human hereditary variations, be they of gender, sexuality, race, and for our discussion today as well, religion. Wynter sees this process as having been initiated in the 15th century in the wake of the voyages of the Portuguese into Africa and those of Columbus under the aegis of the Spanish state, both in the context of the rise of Renaissance humanism. In this moment, the lives of the peoples of Africa, Europe, and the Americas would be forever changed and their destinies linked. This forced and highly conflictual coming together was also precisely the moment during which the Portuguese traders, following upon their arrival in Southeast Asia and India, employed the word caste to describe their encounter with hereditary, endogamous groups observing rules of ritual purification. As many scholars and others have noted, at the origin of the modern world then, the belief system of race served a structuring role institutionally and conceptually. I use the term belief system intentionally because I want to analogize, compare, or see the idea of race as being inextricable from what we now think of as religion and also the secular. In Winter's terms, the paradox of Renaissance humanism that challenged the hegemony of the church and its theocentric system of knowledge would be by revalorizing natural man, the peoples of Africa and the Americas would be redescribed as human others. The inseparability of race and religion can be seen in British North America in two revealing moments, one in the North and one in the South. Until the late 17th century, conversion to Christianity could confer freedom on the enslaved. However, with the passage of laws in colonial Virginia in the 1660s, such no longer became the case. Whereas before, with the belief that all are one in the body of Christ, and therefore what the biologists call conspecifics, that is, members of the same species, which I mean here kind, cannot be enslaved. However, as A. Leon Higginbotham's study of colonial law has shown, race replaced religion as the qualifier for enslavement. Of course, such was already the basis of slavery in the Portuguese and Spanish colonies in the Americas, though not quite in the same juridical terms. However, before this transformation in the South, in colonial New England, the first legal codification of slavery occurred with the 1641 Massachusetts Body of Liberties, written by clergymen, including John Cotton and Nathaniel Ward, and which remained the definition of slavery in Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Connecticut for more than 150 years. Among other regulations, the law stipulated that captives taken in just wars could be enslaved, which is what occurred after the 1638 Pequot War and the 1675 King Philip's War. In both instances, also indigenous peoples were sold to slaveholders in the Caribbean. The 1641 Massachusetts Body of Liberties set in motion a dynamic of profound contradiction that has come to define much of the lived reality of the United States. As this act enumerated the rights and privileges of white Christian settlers, which included protection against search and seizure, right to a trial by jury, as well as penalties when one's rights are violated. Indeed, what became liberty for some was unfreedom, terror, forced labor, and land expropriation for others. For this reason, from the beginning of the formation of the nation, it has been difficult to come to terms with the issue of enslaved Blacks. The founding fathers avoided discussing the issue directly when they could, as can be seen in the sacred charter of the Constitution, where neither the word slave nor slavery appear in the document. Instead, it uses phrases like such persons, other persons, and persons held to service or labor. From this perspective, it became logical that until recently, much of the mainstream scholarship and in the popular imagination, that the story of racial slavery was separate from the official story. Or as Nathan Huggins argued in The Black Odyssey, slavery was a curious abnormality or aberration or a historical accident to be corrected in the progressive upward reach of the nation's destiny. The story was unified. No discontinuity between the colonies and the revolution, nor between the founding and the Civil War, nor between Reconstruction and the present. The holy nation thus acquired a holy history. It was indeed this holy history that Black intellectuals set out to challenge, from David Walker, Frederick Douglass, Fannie Lou Hamer, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr., to today, Reverend William Barber. And it should be noted from a reconceptualized and radical notion of Christianity and Islam. Indeed, in his 1829 appeal to the colored citizens of the world, Walker challenged the discourse of inferiority promulgated by Thomas Jefferson, the advocate of the natural rights of man. Walker stated, "I call upon the professing Christians, I call upon the philanthropists to show me a page of history, either sacred or profane, on which a verse can be found which maintains that the Egyptians heaped the insupportable insult upon the children of Israel by telling them that they were not of the human family." In other words, although Christianity would create the structure and belief of racial hierarchy, for Walker and others, racial hierarchy is not biblical. And nonetheless, in the United States in particular, we find ourselves existing in what Toni Morrison defined as a wholly racialized society, one in which religion remains deeply imbricated, as can be seen from a number of current political issues, from SB 8 in Texas to the war on terror. But it is also a problem for the secular, because it is not the extreme right, but rather the moderate liberal democratic governments of the US and Europe who refuse to support the call for the WHO and other nations of the global South for vaccine equity and sharing technology to produce vaccines everywhere. This despite the tremendous governmental subsidies and the central role that these countries like India and South Africa played in the testing of these vaccines. Here we can see the contradictions of the liberal democratic secular nation state who proclaim equality and insist that we follow science, refusing to do either in this instance. Therefore, we should follow the lead of Reverend William Barber and his movement of the repairers of the breach that challenged both the official religious and secular discourse, and follow in that tradition of radical reconceptualized faith of what Professor Rao has just described as a political theology. To quote Reverend Barber, we challenge the position that the preeminent moral issues are prayer in public schools, abortion, and property rights. Instead, we declare the moral public concerns of our faith traditions are how our society treats the poor, women, LGBTQ people, children, workers, immigrants, communities of color, the sick, the people whom Jesus called the least of these. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Udell, for that